Okay, on today's video I thought I would do a tutorial on how to create a glow effect. It's a feature that I like to put in quite a lot of my paintings that I just do for fun. I find it really adds an element of drama to a piece of work, points of interest, and most importantly it's just a really satisfying and fun thing to be able to add to a piece of work, and I feel that it's relatively straightforward and simple to achieve as well. Having said that, I see that people do seem to struggle with it sometimes, so I thought I'd give a bit of a rundown on how I actually achieve the effect, hopefully to be able to help people find the process a little bit easier themselves. Now, I'm not going to provide a colour palette for this one. It's going to be relatively straightforward. I'm not going to use specific colours for this. It's just going to be colours within a certain range. So you can probably come up with your own versions of this. And also, you can change the colours to suit your required effect for your particular pieces of work too. First thing I am going to do though is going to change the background colour. I'm going to go for something a bit warm because I'm going to do some contrasting blue in this particular piece, but you could do the opposite. You could do some cool colours as a background and then make the glowing lights more of a warm colour by contrast. So what I'm going to do on my first layer is I'm just going to create some forms in which I'm going to imagine them emitting some kind of glowing feature. I'm not quite sure how it's going to go yet. It may be that they have light emanating from deep within, or it could be more of a surface kind of glow, similar to what you might find in many sort of deep sea creatures if you were subjected to certain light conditions, UV lights for example. So on my first layer I'm going to stick with very dark colours really. I may well add reflective properties or features. If I'm on soft airbrush, this is typically what I will use on my tutorials, and what I'm doing to start with is I'm just going to generate some forms. Now from these forms I'm going to have light emitting. I do quite like creating sort of organic looking shapes, tree-like forms, branches, and so first of all I'm just going to create a bit of a kind of silhouetted form and then we'll go from there. Just switch to the medium brush just to create a harder edge on some of these shapes, and I've got the opacity on full, and then the colour I'm using is just it's not quite black, but it doesn't really have much colour either, just a very dark grey kind of colour. Perhaps just has a slight sense of coolness by contrast to the background, but it doesn't matter. It could be a totally different kind of range of colours, but basically it's this darker form contrasted on a slightly lighter background. All I'm wanting to do is just create a stage for the light to exist. In fact, with that layer, I'm going to make it a little bit darker. So I'm in Procreate, and if you go onto the adjustments and you can go on the hue, saturation and brightness, I'm just going to make it a little bit darker. And then if I want any more subdued versions in the background, then this is going to be the darkest one, more in the foreground. I'm going to select the colours that I want to glow, and I'm thinking some kind of turquoisey kind of colour, somewhere between blue and green. I'm going to switch to my soft brush because I want to do this very gradually, therefore I'm going to turn the opacity down as well. I'm going to turn the size of the brush down, and what I'm going to do now is start imagining that there are shapes on the surface that are glowing. Now it's important that I do this on a lower opacity. If I start with really high opacity, the light looks quite good in a sense, but it's not going to get the best effect. So I'm going to turn the opacity down. I'm going to start doing this a little bit more gradually. I want variation in the degree of glow because I'm imagining it as a kind of rounded surface, or it's curving away on this edge. Then I'm imagining spots that are glowing will get a bit more clustered edge, and then as they come rounded to this side, then the gap between them will become so they could become more clustered on the edge, and then bigger gap as they come more to the forefront, keeping these quite rough as a whole. So something that I'm already doing even at this stage is perhaps just making some of the larger spaces a bit brighter. So if there's a shape and then there's a bigger section at the end perhaps, then that's going to have a bit more brightness. So I'm going over that and doubling up on the intensity. I feel I need to start focusing on an area just to show you the effect, and then I could always extend that across the whole image. So now I've got a rough kind of outline about where I want the glowing forms or the glowing features to be. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to start going over some of these areas a little bit more. So I'm doubling up on the intensity. So it's important that you get like an outer layer that's more subdued, and then it gets more intense as it gets towards the center. To a certain extent anyway. I'm not going to do very much of this. I'm just laying a bit more groundwork before I really get to some of the effects that are useful. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'll do this on a separate layer, and I will put it above that initial layer, and I'm going to increase the size of the airbrush, and I'm going to turn the opacity down now. And what I can do is I can just spend a bit of time going over some of these forms just very lightly, and just doing this you'll notice that it almost creates like a halo effect around it. And if it's a smaller feature, just like a small dot, I might just press it in the center of that shape. And because we've got a bigger, more diffused brush size, then just a couple of presses on that particular shape is really going to help. If I create another layer, and I'm going to take the color, but just really ramp up the brightness of it now. So I'm going to go pretty much to a white. I'm going to reduce the size of the airbrush. And what I'm going to do now is just in places, just give it a real sharp focus of light. This is going to really sell the idea that there's an intense glow. It might be that not all the forms are going to have the same intensity of glow. Maybe as they curve round and face you as the viewer, and we get a more intense light. Maybe it's a hole through. Now we've got that as a layer above the other layer. We can go back to that layer, and if we wanted to, we could move along the saturation of the colour, turn the size of the brush up, and the opacity down, go to an area that we think should be one of the lightest colours, like this. This is one of the features that emits the most light, and we can just, again, go over it. Now it's not going to spoil the white, because that's on a layer above. We'll just go into a layer underneath. I'm just intensifying the effect in these areas. What I'm going to do on this layer is also perhaps extend the effect of some of these forms. Another feature when you have something that emits light is that when it hits a surface, it's going to illuminate the surface too. So it might be that between these areas that emit light, there are some other shapes that perhaps reflect the light back. So what I'm going to imagine is it's almost like a tree bark perhaps, and there's texture and there's areas that pick up on the light, maybe cracks in the texture, and then when you see deep into the branch, there's light emerging from the inside of it, in which case as it bounces out it's going to reflect the surfaces around it. So in that respect I'm just creating some extra lines showing the impact that the light is having, because I think if you're going to try and sell a light effect, I think it's very important to show its effect on other things. So one thing you'll notice I'm doing is I'm creating variation in strength of light. So there'll be some bits where it's very intense, and then other bits where it sort of trails off and becomes more subdued. I think to have just certain features have a real intensity, I think will create a better effect. Because if, for example, I was to just create a channel like this, it seems almost a bit featureless, too mechanical perhaps. I mean, maybe sometimes you'd want to create something with exactly that effect, but I think if you're trying to show light emitting from a specific point or collection of specific points, then it's better to have it trailing off. So again, I'm going to go onto the top layer to a white. I'm just going to perhaps just magnify the intensity of certain areas. I'm hoping that these don't just get totally flooded out on camera. And if I wanted to extend the impact that bright light is having again, see, that's too much. So turn the intensity down. So you can see there very clearly that it's easy to overdo it. If you're wanting to create the halo effect, it has to be very subtle. So turn the opacity way down and then go over it again. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to put this at the bottom, and I'm going to use this layer to create a sense of slightly more distant forms. And what I'm going to show is how atmosphere, perhaps atmospheric conditions, will actually diffuse the light even more dramatically on a more distant form. So I'm going to select the colour that was there, go onto my colour wheel, and perhaps just have a slightly lighter version of it. And it's an underneath layer that I'm using, so it doesn't matter, it's not going to interfere. I'm going to change the brush to a medium brush, the opacity is on full. I'm going to create some more forms similar to what I've already got, but slightly more in the distance. And perhaps also we could create an even lighter colour, and I'm going to put that underneath both of those layers, and this is going to be just a slightly lighter version still. If you find it difficult to get a colour that's lighter than the other colour, it's not a problem because they're on separate layers. Therefore you could go to that layer on the adjustments and you can use the brightness to really fine tune what you're getting. So I'm going to do that because I'm struggling to get something that's just a little bit lighter than that as a colour. So I'll create a general colour to begin with, doesn't matter too much, and then I'll use the adjustments to really lighten it up and make it more distant. So now I can go to the adjustments and just lighten it up a bit more, and you can see it's knocked it back now just by doing that instead. So I'm going to use perhaps the most distant form. I'm going to do the same process, probably better if I create another layer above it so I can adjust that layer without damaging the branches. I'm going to do exactly the same process that I was using before. Make sure I'm on soft airbrush, turn the opacity down, size of the brush down, so I can add some surface details to the branches, some kind of forms that are emitting light back there. Perhaps not too many of them, maybe just a hint of it here and there. What I will probably do now is increase the size of the brush, turn the opacity down, and then just go over those layers, go over that area a bit more, try and diffuse that light in a bit more, increase the size of that, and just really help spread that around a bit. So imagining that it's pushing the light around, so it's really being picked up by the atmosphere in the background there. And what it will do is it will really subdue the darkness of the branches too. I'll do the same thing as I did before. I'm not going to create a separate layer for this. It's a little less necessary. Just put the odd point of white light in there just to intensify it up. If I wanted to have one particular feature that I felt needed to emit the most light, I could perhaps just go to a slightly more bluey version, turn the opacity down, and just go over that section, make that more powerful. The hue is going to be slightly cooler in the distance. Not overly dramatic. If you push it too extreme, then it's going to look like a totally different colour. But if you're subtle with it, you can create a sense of distance just with the colour too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that effect and sort of spread it around the image, and you can start to see how a relatively simple effect can be really quite dramatic and give you a big impact on a piece of work. And as I was showing you earlier, that's really going to help sell the idea that we've got a strong light source there. If it's really impacting the surrounding features and bouncing light back off them, then that really convinces you that that must be a bright light. So you can see here I've gone really quite dramatic for the impact of the features in the background, really push the extremes. Maybe it's extremely foggy, there's a lot of mist, and the light from the background is really diffusing it quite dramatically in the background there. Why not? Maybe within this form up here, for example, we could go and really add some focused features. Now, it's not supposed to be necessarily a man-made form or even a science fiction thing, but I tend to think of things in quite natural terms. But I think the quality of the light is certainly adding a sci-fi element to it, and that's fine. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't apply this technique to something slightly less sci-fi. My main focus of the video is to really just point you in the direction of how to convincingly sort of portray the idea of a glowing light source. Maybe one or two of these, like I say, and diffusing it more, so I'm increasing the size of the brush, turning the opacity down, and just press onto that particular shape. Maybe they will stand out a bit better. If I really wanted to be very dramatic about this cluster here and really try and get across that it's really very intense light, I could seriously whack up the size of the brush, turn the opacity down, and just start to, you're probably starting to lose some of the sense of detail on camera by doing that. That's the kind of power that effect has. I can knock it back a stage perhaps. Just going to do a last little bit of fine tuning. This is not by any stretch a finished painting of mine, but I can't resist really just adding a bit more detail. Just wanted to give you a bit of a sense of how you can start to build up a certain kind of effect. I do lots of different kind of tutorials. Many instances my demonstrations and lessons will be more conventional scenes, more traditional kind of landscapes. I just thought I'd want to do something a bit different this time, add a bit of variety. But even though the overall effect and the colours are more science fiction-like, fantasy-like, like I said, this could easily be applied to different kind of glowing effects too, whether that be stars in the sky or even the sun itself. Could be street lights in a more urban environment. I think if you have a go at doing something like this, just to really play around with the effects, I think that you'll get a sense of what works, what doesn't, and then that greater experience will help you when you come to do different kinds of scenes. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. It's not a finished piece by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm quite happy with some of the glowing effects. Hopefully it's been interesting and useful. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people that have supported me over our Patreon page. There is a link for that down in the description. If you visit there, then I do offer HD downloads, full layered files for those people that actually support me over there too. Otherwise, please make sure to press the bell subscribe symbol. If you don't press the bell symbol, then you won't necessarily get updated every time I do a new video. So please make sure to press that, and I shall catch you back here again. See you later.